Fallujah, west of Baghdad. The rebels' bastion seems to be awakening the day after an earthquake. 8 years after the war, its inhabitants are still living among the ruins. At Fallujah Hospital, doctors are fighting another war. Today, as every day, the maternity unit is on alert. A deformed baby has just been born, the 5th this week. This newborn is suffering from serious malformations. The doctors think he will survive, but he may never be able to walk.
He needs an operation. At the moment, he's much too weak for us to move forward with surgery. So we have him on observation. We have seen many other types of deformities. He's not alone. Some are more severe than others. We have some babies born without skulls, without organs, and sometimes with their legs totally twisted. Oh, look at his little legs.
The mother of this baby is in shock. This woman has had 3 children before this one, all born without any health problems. This deformed baby is the first such case in her family. But there's a dramatic rise in such phenomena. In Fallujah, 1 birth in 5 now exhibits congenital malformation. This doctor sees only one possible solution, and it is radical.
I advise the old women in Fallujah city to not have more babies.
How did it come to this? All these babies were born after 2004, when Fallujah endured one of the most violent battles ever witnessed on Iraqi soil. Bombs and shells rained down on the city for several weeks. 15,000 coalition soldiers were marshaled to crush Fallujah. Facing them were 2,000 Iraqi resistance fighters, armed with Kalashnikovs and rocket launchers. The U.S. Air Force dropped hundreds of tons of bombs. These pictures show fireballs falling on the city. This is white phosphorus, a chemical incendiary weapon. Today, this bombing is said to have caused the malformations in the children of Fallujah. Baghdad, winter 2011. How can you tell whether a city is no longer at war? Perhaps by observing the passers-by crisscrossing the streets. In Iraq, peace is gradually settling, but the stench of war is still noticeable. The Iraqi capital alternates between days of violence and days of peace. The U.S. Army is committed to pulling out of the country by December. The police and the Iraqi army will step into its shoes. These traffic jams are an indicator of peace in Iraq. The city seems revived, with businesses springing up once again and residents doing their shopping in the city center. A city center that is returning to its pre-war opulence. But is the war really over? Though the situation in Baghdad has improved, other cities have been tossed into the garbage. Fallujah, for instance, my parents' hometown. After the war, the city was totally cut off. Only the inhabitants had the right to come and go freely. But I have family and friends there, and I speak Iraqi Arabic. I make contact with a friend in Fallujah.
Come at 3 o'clock. Close to the statue. I'll come and pick you up and we'll go wherever you want.
This is Abu Yunus. He's 32 years old, a former football player for Fallujah, now unemployed. I first met him while doing a news report 4 years ago. It was he who called my attention to these seriously deformed babies. He came to Baghdad to fetch me, because it's not possible for me to get to Fallujah without his help. This road is closely monitored. In traveling the 50 kilometers that separate Baghdad from Fallujah, we go through more than 20 checkpoints. The city is located in the middle of the Sunni Triangle, also called the Triangle of Death by the Americans. Some 1,500 U.S. soldiers have been killed in this region, 1/3 of the American casualties in Iraq.
Fallujah was the first city to fight back against American occupation. It found fame by throwing them out of town and inflicting great loss of life. So much so that the people wondered how a small city like Fallujah could resist against the world's most powerful army.
In March 2004, 4 mercenaries under contract to the U.S. Army were killed in their vehicle on the outskirts of town. Their mutilated bodies were dragged through the streets, then hung under this bridge as trophies. It was one of the very first acts of violence against the United States. These pictures were soon seen all over the world. It was the start of an escalation that culminated in the Battle of Fallujah in November 2004. The death toll listed 134 GIs and 3,500 Iraqis. Fallujah became a symbol of the revolt. Accordingly, the army imposed very strict checks in the city. The fingerprints and retina scans of every last inhabitant were recorded in U.S. Army files. Never has any town undergone such treatment. Residents were even issued with biometric ID cards.
This badge enables me to enter and leave Fallujah.
7 years later, the badges are no longer needed. The city is now under the control of the Iraqi army, but Fallujah remains the hardest place in the country to get into.
You need a guarantor to enter, and he must be from Fallujah. I've been asked to be responsible for you for safety reasons.
So you can't just walk into Fallujah?
No, not like that.
As we approach the city, the tension mounts in the car.
No, stop filming. Put the camera down.
Here we are at the entrance to Fallujah, 100 meters from a border post within a country. The Iraq army is checking each car that passes. To take in a camera, you need special permission and an armed escort. But to give us freedom of movement, we'd rather enter legally.
There are several cars in front of us. We're in the 3rd one. We're waiting. Come and fetch us.
Thanks to Abu Yunus, one of the soldiers lets us through. For his own safety, we don't film him. After an hour's wait, we finally pass through the checkpoint. Welcome to Fallujah, 300,000 inhabitants, considered the most dangerous city in Iraq. Nothing here has really changed since the battle. Life goes on, the streets are teeming, but the traces of war are still here, and the Iraqi soldiers carry on patrolling. In this prison town, it's hard to keep a low profile if you're carrying a camera, so to keep us safe as we move around within Fallujah, Abu Yunus follows close behind. He'll be our guardian angel. This neighborhood is one of the hardest hit by the bombing. Half the buildings are in ruins. Not one wall has been spared by bullets. This former Iraqi soldier was in the city during the American assault. He lives just opposite this building, totally destroyed. During the bombing, he noticed suspicious explosions.
Just after the bombing began, the landscape changed. Even the appearance of the sky changed. The sky became kind of yellow. It lasted for several days. Even the explosions were abnormal. Now, I'm a fighter. I was an officer in the Iraqi army under the old regime. I fought for 7 years in the war against Iran. So bombs and missiles, I've seen a lot of them. I know what I'm talking about. But with these American bombs, it was different. They exploded and they produced something abnormal, something that I don't think I've ever seen before.
The strange bomb that this resident refers to contained white phosphorus, a chemical incendiary weapon often compared to the napalm used in Vietnam. According to the Geneva Convention, Civilians and civilian objects may not be attacked in any circumstances by incendiary bombs. Basically, the use of white phosphorus is banned in any populated zones. The American Army claims to have used it only to illuminate combat zones. Yet in Fallujah, thousands of inhabitants were still in the city during the bombing. Abu Yunus arranges to meet me at the Martyrs Cemetery, a former football stadium. 3,500 bodies are buried here, resistance fighters and civilians alike. This is where Abu Yunus played football. Today, he comes to meditate at the graves of former teammates, now become martyrs.
Some of the footballers who used to play in this stadium are buried here. Even the coach, we called him Khalil Cowboy. Even he was killed by the Americans. In all, I think 13 players from the Fallujah team are buried in their own football ground.
This man is the caretaker of the cemetery. One day in November 2004, while burying the victims of the fighting, he made a strange discovery.
The Americans brought me sacks. At first, I thought it was humanitarian aid. But when I opened them, just look what I found. Bits of bones and clothes intact. Their translator told me these corpses were American, and that's why they'd given them back.
The caretaker recovered close to 500 unidentified bodies. He photographed each one before burying them in the cemetery.
So we asked the doctors, and they told us that if there are only bones and the clothing is intact, then it's because of white phosphorus. And what happened to this man? Well, it looks like it's due to a chemical weapon. God knows what it is. But that's phosphorus, too.
The caretaker is in no doubt. These men were killed by white phosphorus. Did the U.S. Army use these weapons against the population? What are these photos really hiding? To find an answer, I must go to the United States. Far from Iraq and its ruined buildings, Boston. I made contact with Ras Kaputi, a 27-year-old former Marine who fought at Fallujah. Though he looks like a teenager, Ras Kaputi is already a war veteran. Traumatized by his experience, he decided to testify.
This is me. This is in Fallujah. And I'm really embarrassed to say that I'm kind of posing for this picture. I had the bandana on and I wanted to look tough. And, this is the mentality that we had while we were in there. We were tough war fighters and, these are the type of pictures I wanted to go home and tell my friends about.
In Fallujah, Ross was a radio operator. It was his job to relay information to the other soldiers. He was therefore on the front line.
Before the ground siege actually began, they told us that this was going to be the biggest battle since Way City, Vietnam. They were bombing the city really, really heavily at this point. And they put us on this hill outside the city, kind of overlooking it the night before the ground siege began. And at this point, I remember very clearly seeing the white phosphorus. And I remember very clearly, having this weird feeling about it, this can't possibly be legal. I remember seeing it, sway down in the wind like this. I asked a lieutenant close to me about it. I said, hey, is this legal? And he said, yes, it's legal because we're using it as a smokescreen. We're not using it offensively. And there were thousands of civilians who couldn't leave the city. So wherever we used it, there was a strong possibility that this was going to land on civilians.
So white phosphorus was indeed discharged above the population.
No, I feel really guilty about it. Now I'm fully aware of how many people I hurt and how many people we killed, so that's not easy to live with.
Ras Kaputi decided to quit the army after the Battle of Fallujah. He set up an association to make American public opinion aware of his experience as a soldier in Iraq.
I asked a lieutenant close to me about it. I said, hey, is this legal? And he said, yes, it's legal because we're using it as a smokescreen. We're not using it offensively. And there were thousands of civilians who couldn't leave the city. So wherever we used it, there was a strong possibility that this was going to land on civilians.
So white phosphorus was indeed discharged above the population.
No, I feel really guilty about it. Now I'm fully aware of how many people I hurt and how many people we killed, so that's not easy to live with.
Ras Kaputi decided to quit the army after the Battle of Fallujah. He set up an association to make American public opinion aware of his experience as a soldier in Iraq.
I remember that in my unit there was very little curiosity about who these insurgents in Mouj were. Everyone just seemed content with the rumors that we had heard about them being terrorists and Baptist diehards and anti-Americans of all different sorts.
Though Ras Kaputi denounces the use of white phosphorus, others in the military are glad of it. In March 2005, an American Army major made surprising revelations. In this Army review, he claims that the use of white phosphorus proved highly effective in Fallujah. He adds that he used it willingly against the insurgents. The major refers to such deployment as shake-and-bake missions. According to this officer, white phosphorus was used in Iraq to kill. Given this damning evidence, the international press seized upon the story. They would have to wait until November 16, 2005 for the American administration to officially admit to the media that the city was bombed with white phosphorus. Back to Fallujah. 7 years after the bombing, the population is convinced that white phosphorus is still killing. Such is the case with Khalil. He lives in the Jolan neighborhood, one of the hardest hit by the bombing. In 2005, Khalil founded the first charity for war victims. His aim? To gather as much information as possible, beginning with these files on sick children.
This child, for example, developed a brain tumor just after the bombing back in 2004. And it's the same in this case. There's a serious malformation problem from birth. So we record the information, we establish a medical file, and then we send it off to the doctors and charities. All we really want to try and do is find a solution and help these poor families.
It's a modest office. Khalil doesn't have extensive resources, not even a computer on which to record all this information. He seems overtaken by events.
We knew absolutely nothing about any of these diseases before. When the Americans came here, they were supposed to bring us modernity. Instead, they sent us back to the Stone Age.
Khalil agreed to supply us with the files of sick children. He says that most cases of rare illnesses concern children under 10, like Ziad. He was born after the 2004 attacks with a serious malformation. He is the first case of this type in his family.
He was operated on when he was 47 days old. The house we lived in was bombed. When we returned, I cleaned the place entirely. Maybe it was because of that. I don't know.
Your house was bombed during the battle?
Yes, it was hit by a missile, and half the house was destroyed. The living room, my bedroom, all of it was destroyed. The furniture, too. All we had left was what we're wearing, was this wardrobe. We rebuilt everything ourselves. 1 year later, my son was born with a malformation, and I was told it was linked to the bombing.
How long did you stay in that house?
2 years. We left the house a year after I gave birth.
Why are children who were not alive during the war, and who were therefore not exposed directly to white phosphorus, victims of malformations? What do the Iraqi authorities say? Is it a public health problem? In Fallujah, only the Ministry of the Environment was willing to talk to us.
The truth is, we haven't been able to do any environmental surveys. I mean, it was impossible to carry out any tests at all. The bombing started in 2004, then once again in 2005, and 2006, all the way up until 2010. It was only in 2010 that the Americans left the city. And at that time, if a citizen bent down to pick something up, for example, he looked like a potential bomber. And an American sniper might even shoot him. And that happened several times, I can tell you. All this to say, it was nigh on impossible for us to go to any of these zones with our equipment and carry out our tests. It was far too dangerous.
In Fallujah, nobody has the means to investigate the causes of these illnesses, not even the Iraqi Ministry of the Environment. This upsurge in deformed children isn't among the authorities' priorities. The former rebel stronghold has been sidelined by its own government. A code of silence reigns in Fallujah. Since the end of the war, just one study has shed some light on this. It was carried out in Fallujah in 2009 and was published in a major medical review. This document contains worrying results about the rise in the number of deformed babies. They reveal an explosion in such cases since 2005, 1 year after the Battle of 2004. Aberystwyth, on the west coast of Wales. The author of this paper is Professor Chris Busby, a British scientist specializing in radioactivity. He's secretary of the European Committee on Radiation Risks. Chris Busby is a regular mainstream media guest. In his black beret, he has become an easily recognizable figure on the BBC or Al Jazeera. He was recently consulted on the consequences of the nuclear crisis at Fukushima. Unlike the Iraqi authorities, he has investigated in Fallujah.
But the way around that is to just knock on the door and say, excuse me, I'm asking, how many people have got cancer here in the last 5 years and who lives here? You know, it's very simple. Because if you know who lives there and how old they are, you can then predict how many cancers they should have on the basis of the national average and rates and so on, and just compare them with the numbers that they report. And the one divided by the other is the relative risk. So we did that.
Did you try to go by yourself to Fallujah?
No way. I've got too many people after my cut, so I'm not going to go and stick myself out there. Somebody will pop a bullet through me.
So, how did you...
Yeah, no, well, all I did was I told them what to do. I said, look, I'll tell you what to do. I'll create the questionnaire based on the ones I've done.
And even for an Iraqi team recruited by Chris Busby, the task was complicated.
There's some places they went to, they got beaten up because they thought they were from the Secret Service or the State or the CIA or something. So then we had to start sending people around with some local person that everybody knew, councillor or something, and after that it was okay. And we just finished it when the Iraqi government found out about it, and then they put out something on the television saying we were terrorists, and anybody who answered the questions would go to jail. But it was too late, we'd done it by then, you see.
Well, we know lots and lots of...
On top of the questionnaire, Chris Busby asked for samples of soil and water. Samples of residents' hair were also taken. The test results are astonishing.
Denny's hair samples and the soil samples and all, we measured 52 different elements. So we looked at strontium and barium and neodymium and cobalt and copper and cesium and calcium and you name it, we looked at it. And what we found was that the only element there that could explain that level of congenital malformations and cancer was uranium.
He believes it's not the white phosphorus that is harming the inhabitants of Fallujah, but uranium.
So for instance in Fallujah, the rates of leukemia, for example, are 38 times the expected number based on Egypt. Breast cancer is more than 10 times. Childhood cancer is 14 times. I forget the exact details, but they're huge numbers. There's nothing that you have ever found in any epidemiological study anywhere ever. This is like the highest rate of genetic damage in any population ever studied. It's worse than Hiroshima, yeah.
Why is Fallujah compared to Hiroshima? How did uranium come to be in the city? Officially, no nuclear weapons were used in Fallujah. I continue my inquest in Champaign, Illinois, 200 kilometers from Chicago, and home to Doug Rock. For Doug Rock, the presence of uranium in Fallujah comes as no surprise. This former high-ranking officer served more than 35 years in the U.S. Army, in particular during the First Gulf War. At that time, he headed a research program into the consequences of a new uranium-based weapon. After testing on behalf of the Pentagon, he became its first victim. He now suffers from several cancers and renal problems.
Okay, that's part of the Nevada test we did. And what I'm doing is blowing up, shooting, and burning up. But what you see is the direct impact on the uranium emissions, the uranium impact, but the uranium that breaks up burns and burns and burns and burns and burns for a long time. You see how long it lasts.
He claims that uranium has been used in American munitions since 1991, in missiles, shells, and armor plating for military vehicles.
When I shot up wood 4x4s, man, they were great. This stuff is good. Okay? I mean, you have to understand, the purpose is to kill and destroy. And uranium weapons are the ultimate, because it's a massive fireball of burning uranium fragments that are moving extraordinarily high velocity, and fragments that are not burning that cause massive secondary explosions or massive fires in anything that will burn.
Uranium is a mineral used in nuclear power plants. Part of it is enriched and used as fuel for the reactors. The rest is radioactive waste, known as depleted uranium. As the costs of storage are high, the U.S. Army decided to use some of it to manufacture munitions and armor plating. Doug Rock sees depleted uranium quite simply as a nuclear weapon.
And yes, it is. It's solid radioactive waste. It's chemically toxic. It's radioactive for eternity. It's a dirty bomb. And yeah, it is. Yeah, let's call it nuclear for what it is. It's nuclear waste used to kill and destroy, and thus contaminate air, water, soil, and food that remains there to cause harm for eternity.
This weapon was used for the first time in Iraq in 1991. At the time, the U.S. Army asked Doug to inspect the tons of burnt-out Iraqi tanks destroyed by depleted uranium missiles.
This is measuring the contamination on destroyed...
As a result, Doug and his team were seriously contaminated by inhaling uranium dust. Today, Doug is one of the only survivors of that group.
I mean, you can look at me. I mean, when I looked like that, I was a lot different. Extraordinarily healthy, and now everybody's extraordinarily sick. This is me right there. Yeah, we were the best of the best. Won't lie for him anymore. It's not worth it. Too many people are sick. Too many people are dead.
Since this photo was taken, 21 members of his team have died. Returning from Iraq, Doug submitted an unfavorable report on the use of depleted uranium.
Well, once I told the U.S. Army that it was dangerous, we couldn't clean it up, and they couldn't do it. They sent me packing. Adios, amigos. You know, we don't want to hear from you. We want to talk to you. I mean, you got your job. Keep doing things, but shut up and go away.
The U.S. Army never took Doug Rock's recommendations into account.
Do you think in Fallujah? So you think there's
Fallujah, extensively in Fallujah, totally extensively in Fallujah. Not a question. And we see everything and all the other people. We see every place that's been used. We see it. I mean, you can try to clean it up, but you can't. That's what I tried to do, and I couldn't. That's why I told them no more.